Hello, Karen.
Hey, voila, there you are. Hooray. Matt, thank you very much for your patience with that. We're having a couple of issues with Zoom, so I appreciate your patience and being willing to be flexible. If you'd like to share your video, people can see you. If you choose to remain anonymous, that's all right too. People can also see your beautiful face on your website as well. With that, as long as you're with us, we're going to get rolling and get today started. Thank you again, those of you that are with us on this web seminar, for your patience with the technical difficulties. With the updates that Zoom is doing, there are some which is delightful. It does create a couple of learning curve issues, and some things that you thought were taken care of sometimes aren't, unfortunately. So, or they get changed. So anyway, welcome. Good morning. Hooray, you're here. You're joining us for the third of a series of 7 web seminars presented in partnership with Dakota County CDA and Chamber Partners. Today's topic is focused on business risk, looking at both the operational business as well as the legal aspects. A few housekeeping items. All participants are muted. Please submit your questions using the question and answer feature if you could, please. We are recording this seminar and it will be hosted on the partner websites. We are truly glad you are here. My name is Karen Schaap, and I'm a business advisor for Open to Business servicing the Dakota County area. We service 7 counties here in the metro area. These are unprecedented times, and the goal of these seminars is to provide you valuable information for your small business. Today, we have with us Matthew Schaap. He is the attorney, one of the attorneys for the law firm Dougherty, Molenda, Solfest, Hills, and Bauer. Good morning, Matt. Thank you both for your patience getting us connected online and taking your time to share with us today your thoughts on business risk. I'll let you take it from here.
Well, I consider myself to be pretty tech savvy, but it's a very helpless feeling to engage in some of these Zoom meetings where you think a button is supposed to be there and the button isn't there. So we were able to reconnect with a different login. So now it's working. You could advance the slide. I'm a business attorney, litigation attorney with Dougherty, Molenda, and Apple Valley. We have 16 attorneys in the Wings Financial Building. And like other businesses in the area, we're dealing with a new reality. You can see this slide refers to a black swan event. The black swan is here. It's an event that is very unexpected. It's one that you really can't anticipate, but after it's over, people think that you should have anticipated it. What I would say is don't beat yourself up too much. This is not something that anyone was anticipating. And these events are rare, and they're going to call for a very unique response from your business. And the good news is that the economy was strong before this started, and this is a very unique environment. It's not like the 2008 recession in that it has a lot of different characteristics. You can go to the next slide. So what's the message? From a business risk standpoint, the message is survive now and thrive later. And surviving is a multi-front war. You need to recognize that there are no easy solutions and that no one in your business is probably going to escape unscathed. And this is a time to involve your bank, involve your accountant, and if necessary, your attorney. Each of those professionals plays a unique role in the success of your business now. Go to the next slide. Now, if you think about mitigating risk, what you have to do is survive this, and survival is based on a number of different factors. I want to talk a little bit about revenue to begin with, and then expenses, and then also some contract issues. On the revenue side, many businesses are closed. They need to plan for reopening. Supply chains have been impacted by this. International supply chains have been affected. And there's less work in the service sectors across the board. People are afraid to have contact with a plumber. And the courts are closed, so lawyers are a little bit less busy than usual. It's also impacted government services. And this has all had the collective effect of impacting a lot of businesses that are members of these chambers of commerce. and you know, the thing is too, you see a lot about people working remotely, and we want to say that remote work is effective work, but reality is it's not ideal for people to sit at a kitchen table when all of their kids are at home too. And so working remotely has caused people to be less productive. Sales goals are shot for this quarter, and a lot of people are wondering how to fix that. And you can do things like cut prices. Go to the next slide. The issue at this point is how long is this going to last? And by conserving and stockpiling cash, a business can mitigate its risk that it will die or not survive this crisis. You need to understand the financial risk, not only of your own business, but also of the businesses that you deal with. If you rely on a business to pay you on a regular basis, can you survive if they stop paying? Many times financing and lines of credit are available in good times, and in difficult times, those might be less available to you. So it's a good idea to know what you have access to if you really need it in a crisis. In good times too, businesses let receivables they get lazy about receivables. They don't collect them, they don't think about them. Now is a time to think about taking a discount on receivables to put that cash into your operating account so that it can be used in this crisis. And the problem is with that too, there are other businesses that are thinking the same things, and they're not really looking to pay down the debt they've owed for quite some time that you haven't collected on. So you have to be strategic in what you collect now and be willing to take a discount. You can also find new streams of revenue. So this is all on the revenue side. Sometimes the crisis creates its own revenue. There are some businesses that are pivoting quickly. You may or may not be able to do that based on your unique circumstances. Go to the next slide. Now this crisis is unique in that there is a lot of government help available. And the first two webinars in this series have been really good at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce laying out the CARES Act in general. And then with Bruce Goblersh on Friday talking about the Paycheck Protection Program and the amazing gift that is essentially from the federal government. And that is underway. There are banks taking those applications. That is a significant program, and if as a small business you haven't looked at that yet, you need to look at it today. It is a significant, essentially a government giveaway if it works the way I think it's designed to work. Talk with your SBA lender and your usual banker, and your best relationship to leverage there is your normal banking relationship. There are also EIDL loans. If you're looking for more significant amounts of money that will have to be repaid, you can look at an EIDL loan. We're going to talk about this more on Wednesday when we deal with a lot of the employment issues that businesses are facing in this crisis, as they think about laying people off, as they think about sick workers coming to the office. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act protects workers who are sick and who can't work because of coronavirus, or who are off work because they need to be home with their kids, who don't have school or childcare. There are also a lot of tax credits and things that are going on with delayed tax payments, and an accountant is going to be a great resource for strategically looking at what you can do to benefit in that regard. There's also help for employees. So employees who are laid off, who can't be kept on the payroll, also have access to unemployment benefits both through the state and through the federal government. There's a supplemental in that regard. Go to the next slide. So expense management is really the key to preserving cash. And when your revenues are pressured, as some of your businesses are, some of your revenues have dried up completely. The question is, how do you cut expenses and look for ways to survive on the expense side? So, with regard to employees, it's a very sensitive issue. We'll talk about this more on Wednesday, but you need to protect your employees to the extent you plan to reopen. Protect them in this crisis, and they'll be there to activate on the other side of this. The Paycheck Protection Program and the Families First Coronavirus Response Act are going to be supportive to your employees in different ways. Your rent is going to be a significant thing as well. So employment expenses and real estate expenses are two of the biggest expenses that companies have. And what can you do with your rent in this crisis? If you're on the tenant side, which many of you are, now is a good time to limit your rent through negotiation, or limit payments now and pay later, or just abate rent entirely. Some landlords are willing to do that in this kind of an environment because they want you there. They want you paying 3 months from now. They don't want a vacant space at the end of this crisis. Can you extend your payables? Can you reach agreements to preserve your supply chains so that if you extend your payment terms a little bit farther out? This crisis is not going to last forever. I don't have a crystal ball, but the sense is that this is going to be a few months of all times for businesses. But you may be able to extend your payables and save some cash that way. You can reduce your variable costs, freeze hiring. I'm sure that's not an issue for most businesses. They're not hiring anyway. But take out unnecessary travel and client expenses. The other way to preserve or to gather cash in a crisis is to sell assets. You could potentially sell an asset and lease it back, pulling out the equity. You can reduce your inventory, consider delaying replacement of inventory to preserve cash. And then also formulate a long-term strategy to protect your assets. You might have assets that you're not going to be able to pay for in this crisis. How can you survive the crisis and keep the asset till the end by negotiating with the financing party in that transaction? Next slide. Employees are obviously obviously a part of your expense side that are really important to this calculation. I'm going to talk more about this on Wednesday. I don't want to take too much time here, but use your employees to help you to cut costs. And also think about the long term. Your business is not going to be destroyed by this crisis. And if it's not, if employees are taking leave now, you may improve your balance sheet down the road by getting that off. Next slide. So here's where the more legal side of things comes in. Your leases and mortgages are some things that you should really be reviewing right now. Leases, oftentimes in small business context, have personal guarantees tied to them. They might guarantee the full period that the lease covers, or they might bleed off over time. If you have a personal guarantee, you need to look at that, especially if you're considering closing your business as a result of this crisis. A personal guarantee is something that allows your landlord to sue you individually, not just your business. And so that can have an impact on your family, on your personal assets, things that are outside of your business. Leases also permit landlords most of the time to recover attorney's fees. So in these negotiations, they may not just be asking for the rent, they might be asking for the attorney's fees of collecting the rent down the road. So it's something to think about. I would recommend that everyone think about negotiating and avoiding litigation. As a litigation attorney, I sometimes think, I'm not a surgeon recommending surgery. I'm a litigation attorney that tells people don't litigate if you don't have to, because it's expensive and painful. And now is a time when I think when both landlords and tenants are motivated to negotiate and try to work with each other. But there's some caveats to that. You can seek a reduction or forgiveness of rent. You can pay your rent or mortgage with Paycheck Protection Program money for 8 weeks. But the problem is landlords know this too. So if as a tenant, you're negotiating with your landlord saying, hey, I don't have the money to pay the rent, they might be thinking, well, you just got 2.5 times your monthly payroll and benefits expenses in the form of a forgivable loan. I want my rent because it can be used to pay rent and utilities. And I'd recommend that if you're wondering about that program, that you watch the webinar from Friday. What I would say too is get it in writing. It's important that you get these things written down. Now is not the time to make informal deals that you're going to regret later, or informal deals that don't include all the terms they need to include. because there's going to be a lot of litigation that comes out of this crisis, and you don't want to be one of those parties that could have had a contract, could have amended the lease in writing, but didn't, and now there are questions about what the parties intended. Go to the next slide. So evictions in this time frame are really a question. An eviction can be started upon the filing of a complaint, and the hearing is scheduled within 7 to 14 days, typically. But the courts have closed for most civil matters, and evictions are in a kind of a gray area. The governor's order, the Order 2014, and you'll see a list of executive orders on his website, limits residential evictions based on either leases or foreclosures. Now, residential is obviously not where most of you are, unless you're a residential landlord, but residential evictions are precluded or prevented right now. But that doesn't mean that a commercial tenant can't be evicted. And so if you are a commercial tenant, you could potentially face eviction if you stop paying your rent during this time. Now, how quickly your hearing is going to occur and whether there will be changes to commercial evictions is a day-to-day issue that we are monitoring, because some states, including New York and California, have temporarily banned commercial evictions. Next slide. With regard to contracts, a lot of people are canceling events. Those events are tied to contracts. A few areas that I wanted to just highlight briefly are there's a force majeure clause in many contracts. It's a term that means superior force. It excuses a party's non-performance under a contract when extraordinary events prevent a party from fulfilling its contractual obligations. But it's not that simple, and if that description seems like it might apply to you, you really need to go back to your contract and look at the specific language of your contract. Because unless your contract covers pandemics, viral outbreaks, epidemics, it probably isn't going to cover a COVID-19 event. But this is where you have to look at the specific terms of your contract. And if it comes down to a dispute, contact your attorney. Next slide. The other doctrine is a common law doctrine. It's also statutory to some extent. The impossibility is a contractual doctrine that excuses performance under a contract under certain circumstances. And if you just read this slide, I mean, I think the first bullet should give some people in bad situations a little bit of hope. It's this quote from this case from 1959 is the unforeseen exercise of governmental authority rendering performance of a promisor's contractual obligation impossible will excuse the promisor's obligation. So if the government does something unforeseen that stops you or prevents you from holding an event, for example, the governor issues Executive Order 2020 saying you can't have events and you have to stay at home, then you have a good argument that impossibility is a defense to your performance under that contract. Next slide. Next doctrine is impracticability. I've got a couple cases, a case here where this is mentioned. And this is similar to impossibility. These doctrines kind of are a little bit, impracticability requires a little bit lower burden and a lower threshold. So if you can't quite meet the impossibility defense, you can argue impracticability. But there's a common law doctrine which applies to contracts across the board. And there's also a statutory piece of this that's adopted in the Uniform Commercial Code. The section is there, 336.2-615 of the Minnesota statutes. That will allow some contracts to be breached where, and if you look at the underlying section, where the compliance in good faith with any applicable foreign or domestic governmental regulation or order precludes you from performing under the contract. That's something to clearly consider. Next slide. but there is a nuance, and I wanted to just mention this briefly before we end. The nuance is that there's a case in Minnesota from I think it was 1984, looking back on the crisis of the 1970s with regard to interest rates and gas prices. There was a gas station where the buyer of that gas station didn't want to perform because they felt that the oil crisis made it impracticable for them to perform. And if you can read this later, but the courts have essentially said that if economic conditions are one of the risks that the buyer takes when they buy a business, then you're not going to get out of performance if the economy goes south. So if it's just a general economic downturn, that's not going to be sufficient to satisfy the impracticability defense most of the time. Next slide. I also just wanted to briefly say something about insurance. Many of you might think you have business interruption insurance. It might apply. I would say that after the SARS crisis, many insurers excluded this type of a crisis from their policies. So it probably doesn't cover what you're experiencing now. You've probably already checked. Many of you have probably made that call a month ago. But it certainly makes sense to do that check, but you probably don't have coverage for this. With that, we got a little bit of a later start than we hoped, but that's all I had. Questions?
Well, you certainly did a good job catching up so that we're not too late behind. So thank you very much. Well, we do have just a few questions, starting specifically with tactics with regard to how you approach having a conversation with a contractual holder. There are a number of businesses that, you know, they get into it, they kind of learn as they go, and this is the first time that they've ever signed a lease or maybe signed a supplier contract, may or may not have had somebody review it with them, and so now are kind of in a position of, how do I actually negotiate this before I actually call a lawyer? Do you have some recommendations about what that looks like, or kind of steps maybe to consider?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what you do in those circumstances is you think about what your motivations are, what you're able to do, what you can put on the table, and then also think about what the other side is going through, experiencing, and thinking. By kind of understanding the motivations of both sides, you're in a good position to make the phone call. And if you can talk to someone in person, that's the best way to do it. If you've done business with them in the past, that human element is the best thing to leverage. Email is usually not a great way to do it, but I would say that if you have an email trail of what's happened, that causes less confusion about people misinterpreting what's said on the phone, and ultimately you do want to get it in writing. But in these contexts, there's always a little bit of motivation in this kind of uncertain environment for both sides to work out a new term or do something new so that both can make their way through the crisis. Most of the time, neither side wants to see the other fail because the contract has become too difficult to perform in a crisis. So I'd reach out directly. And if that doesn't work, you know, that's when you involve an attorney or take other steps.
So for you, when you, those are perfect steps, and that's a beautiful example. If you think about somebody that's never done that before, what's one piece of advice as they're looking at putting that together and having that conversation, whether it's with a landlord? What's one thing, if you were to like sit in front of them and say, this is my one piece of advice for you, if you follow this process, in addition to that, this is the one thing that will help you through this, what would that one thing be?
Put together a proposal before you get to the meeting. Don't come into the meeting sort of just fishing for them to make a proposal. Come with a plan so that you have a clear outline of what you want to accomplish, and also sort of parameters around what you think you can do on the high end and what you think you would like to do on the low end, if it's something where you're having a difficult time paying.
Would you agree that this applies to your banker, so for a mortgage as well as for a creditor as well as for a landlord?
It could, and I think a lot of banks are definitely being proactive in that they're reaching out and looking at their business relationships and even agreeing to delay mortgage payments during the crisis, so that the mortgage doesn't become the thing that that breaks the business. So there definitely are even invitations from the banking industry to have this discussion. So take up your banker and on these requests and these invitations. And oftentimes this is the great time when the community banks and the banks that we have relationships with through the chambers of commerce can be the most important.
Cool, thank you. Talk to us a little bit about, and this is going to sound kind of in the weeds, but a little bit of the force majeure, because a lot of times I've chatted with folks over the past couple of weeks and they say, well, I've got an act of God clause in my contract. Isn't that the same thing? And doesn't it cover everything? And so can you kind of balance the high level and not too far in the weeds as far as why it does and why it doesn't cover an act of God in this context?
This isn't a traditional act of God as that term is understood. And a force majeure clause is something that is also very specific. It's not like, if you read the ones that are in your contracts and they're buried somewhere near the end, they're not probably going to foresee an event like this where the entire economy shuts down as a result of a viral epidemic or pandemic. So the problem is that, as a general concept, yes, it could be written into contracts, and I guarantee many contracts will be rewritten in the future. But the issue is that many past contracts likely did not include this because it just was it was a black swan kind of event where it's so unexpected that, and now people will say, well, we should have planned for it, we should have seen it coming, but the reality is we just didn't see it coming.
Cool, thank you. So let's talk just briefly, if you will, about on the front end, you really did a lovely job kind of talking about mitigating business risk from an overall business. When you put this presentation together, you started there, you're a business yourself. When you started there, how did you interpret kind of that risk in relation to the law questions that your clients are coming at you with right now? So is there, when you put your first set of slides together that are more operationally focused, do you know where those operational things start to touch your legal concerns? And is that why you started with kind of a business operational focus and then specific into the legal aspects of it?
Well, I think, there are aspects of the latter part of the presentation where you're talking about contracts, you're talking about really expense side things where you're taking in money or you're spending money. And a lot of these, the lease and with your employees, you're spending money. And the business risks I see are largely contractual as far as the attorneys are involved. When it comes to a contract, when it comes to that negotiation, those are the kinds of things that attorneys are seeing and experiencing. I also think that there's a lot of uncertainty around a lot of these programs. A lot of these programs are so new and they're changing on such a frequent basis that bankers are having a difficult time keeping up. Attorneys are having challenges keeping up. And so those revenue side things that all businesses are experiencing are a way that we can try to preserve as much of our ability to pay expenses as possible. But don't miss those things and go straight to your lease or straight to your contracts, because some of the other strategies potentially have the ability to get you not just through the next 3 months, but to put you in a position to restart your business in 4 or however long this crisis lasts.
I think if you said 4, there's all sorts of people that the shivers just went up their spines. So we're just about ready to wrap things up. Again, we started a little bit late and I want to be respectful of everybody's time, Matthew, including yourself. What is one thing in addition to what you have on here that you kind of wish to kind of leave people with today?
I think now is a great time to have these discussions with a negotiating discussion with parties who either owe each other money, or if you owe money, think about what the human side of this looks like. Most people know that your business is hurting. Most people know that businesses in general are not business as usual. And so strike the balance between what's fair and also what's possible for your business. And I think in those negotiations, lawyers sometimes get a skewed view of how negotiations work, because usually by the time it gets to us, things are not going well. But before that point, before you get to the lawyer, you can have a lot of productive discussions with other parties in these contractual relationships, because there's a mutual benefit to both sides in a contract surviving something like this.
Lovely. Thank you very much. With that, we will conclude a couple of little housekeeping items before we wrap things up. I just want to thank again, this webinar series was done in partnership with Dakota County CDA and the supporting chambers in that area. So thank you very much. This is the third in a series of 7 web seminars focused on specific small business COVID-19 related issues. Matthew will be joining us again Wednesday, April 8th, to talk specifically about employee management. We hope you have a chance to join us. Again, a little about Open to Business. We're a nonprofit contracted by the 7 metro counties to provide free business consulting and gap financing. This recording of the seminar will be shared with our county partners and posted on their websites. Thank you, all of you, for your patience today and for joining us. Matthew, thank you again for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.